Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom Eddington. I'm filling in for Jim Garrison while he's away in France, leading a couple of Ubiquity University courses at Chartres and in the Dordogne, exploring the caves. I am delighted to fill in today, and particularly on a topic that we're focused on around women and peace. And before we get into today's program, I just want to share a couple of thoughts. Back on December 24th of 1968, Apollo 8 astronaut William Anders took an iconic photo of a planet Earth from the moon. It's called Earthrise, and it's probably one of the most famous photos ever taken. And it's an extraordinary photo. I think we probably all have seen it. Anybody who hasn't seen it, I would encourage you to go to the internet and just type in Earthrise and take a look at this extraordinary photo of planet Earth, this blue marble, as we have grown to call planet Earth, in the darkness of the space, of outer space. It's extraordinary, and we all have become familiar with the phrase, we're all connected. And when we look at that image, we understand and appreciate what it means to be human, how vulnerable we are in the expanse of the universe, and why it's so important for us in this finite ecosystem that we live in, planet Earth, to be reminded of the importance of peace, and to get to the fundamental core of what it means to be human. It's in our DNA. We're hardwired for collaboration and cooperation. So just delighted today to be focused on women peacemakers, the hidden side of peacemaking. Joining us today is Barbe Chambliss. She'll provide a presentation highlighting 6 of the 60 women throughout the world Barbe has interviewed over the last 30 years. Her effort culminated in a Ph.D. dissertation and ultimately in a book titled Women Peacemakers, What We Can Learn from Them. She'll describe what this kind of peacemaking is, why it's important, how it's done, and who does it. She'll explain why this kind of conscious peacemaking has the potential to make war irrelevant. Barbe will show how this work is beginning to be taught in schools and developed into a curriculum for teachers and organizations in collaboration with the National Peace Academy. So before we bring Barbe into the conversation, let's just take a moment, as we do each day on Humanity Rising, to breathe and to center ourselves. So Georg, if you could bring up the breath video. I would just encourage everyone to soften or close your gaze and to breathe in for about 5.5 seconds. And when you hear the chime, to exhale for 5.5 seconds. We'll take 10 breaths together and then get into the program. Welcome. Thank you, Georg. So Barb, I'd like to bring you into our conversation today. And just to complete a little bit more about your background, Barb is a retired trauma therapist, mediator, educator, and author. In the midst of interviewing the women peacemakers around the world, she volunteered to work in Croatia with children who had barely survived the Bosnian War, which changed everything for Barb. Now her purpose is to wake up the conscious peacemaker in as many people as possible. She directs the Volunteer Center for Conflict Resolution in Aspen, Colorado, and has taught mediation to over 600 children and adults in rural Colorado schools. She facilitates restorative justice circles in her community. And then behind the scenes today, we have Rita Marsh, a Humanity Rising junkie and the leader of the Center for Human Flourishing in Carbondale, Colorado. So thank you for your angelic presence today, Rita. Welcome, Barb. And you've got yourself on mute.
So I can write a book, but sometimes I can't handle the mechanics. So that Rita is extra special to me. Right. Thank you
So
for
let's get into your presentation, Barb, and look forward to our conversation.
Okay, great. So you'll see on the right a book. I've interviewed over about 60, but more than 60 women peacemakers all around the world, and 15 of them ended up in this book, not because they're any more special than the other 45, but because they represent different areas of the world, different kinds of peace projects that they did. And it was published after my dissertation, whose title was Women Peacemakers, the Hidden Side of Peacemaking. What I'm going to try and do this morning is not only introduce you to some of the women, but I'd like you to listen to the stories, not only about what the women did, but the peacemaking aspect of them is how they did it. I will try and give you some information about that for each person. In the end, one of my goals is to wake up the peacemaker in as many people as possible, and I call it the conscious peacemaker. You'll hear me describe difference between spontaneous and conscious peacemaking here. And so just be thinking about yourself as you hear these stories. And hopefully you're going to say, well, I've done something like that, or I could do something like that, or this isn't rocket science. So listen with that kind of openness. I'm often asked how I even got into this field, and I'm sort of making up the answer to that, but I do know that I'm guessing. I was born in 1944, and so World War II was raging at that time. 18 months after I was born, my country dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I can't believe that a soul brought into the world during those times wasn't deeply affected. And then as I grew up, when I was in college, a lot of my buddies, my male buddies, ended up being drafted and going to Vietnam. And they would be sent off to boot camp, and they'd come home for a couple of weeks between boot camp and their active duty. And boy, could they talk to me about how war was made, everything they'd learned in boot camp. And something inside of me just kept going like, wait a minute, where's the boot camp for peace? And it was sort of a not very popular question at the time, but it kept residing inside of me. So over the course of my life, I've done one or another thing in the field of peacemaking. I've studied 40 years of being a mediator. I even went to work at a military base as a counselor so I could find out how they take citizens and turn them into soldiers. Didn't find out about that as much as I wanted, but I did find a lot out about, I feel if you're going to study peace, you should also study the essence of war. So I was trying to balance it out. I've done restorative justice with kids, which is the way the fabric of a community gets torn when there's a crime in the community. And it's the way that fabric gets rewoven. So I ended up in a PhD program, and I wasn't even really clear why, but when they said, what do you want to study? I said, peacemaking. And in a PhD program, you have to fill in the gaps in the literature. So the gap in the literature, I looked around, there was quite a bit on male peacemakers, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu. And I thought, well, there's not very much about women. And the women, it was the Nobel Peace Prize women that had the most information. So I started thinking I would interview them. But that didn't quite work out because Aung San Suu Kyi was in house arrest. Rigoberta Menchú Tum was in hiding because it was so dangerous for her to have gotten that. So I thought, I'm just going to interview ordinary women. And my committee said, how are you going to find them? You better define peace if that's your topic. Otherwise, how will you even know how to pick people to interview? So I thought about that for a long time. All the written identifications of peace were very complex, very wordy, very wrong. I mean, one of them was the name of a rifle, for instance. And I'm going like, that's not the definition I need. So knowing I was going to be interviewing all over the world, I decided to do a visual definition of peace. And this is it. If you look at my hands, they're equal here. I would say this is my definition of peace because it's equal respect, equal opportunities. And if I do this, one up, and we go like this, one up and one down, I say this is not respect because there's a dominant and a subordinate element to the whole thing. So I would basically go to people and I would say, well, I'll give you an example. The first interview I ever did was we had a music concert in Colorado where I live, and it was by 5 Irish brothers. And I went backstage after their performance and I said to them, can you help me find anyone in Ireland that I could interview as a woman peacemakers? And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, if this is peace and this is not, do you know of any woman in Ireland that is making this happen? And they said, oh, no, we're the musicians. But we've got a sister named Fionnuala. Fionnuala is a disc jockey in Dublin. And here's her telephone number. And literally, that's kind of like how I got all the nominations for the women in this book. So the next day I cold called Fionnuala. I had a gigantic telephone. There were no cell phones, so I had a gigantic telephone bill at that time. And Fionnuala gave me 2 names. One of them was a woman named Bernadette Devlin, which some of us may have known. And the other one was a woman named Sister Sarah Clark. I then went over to Europe. I went over to England. Well, let me just go back and say they let me put my PhD tuition on a credit card. So when I had enough, and I put it on a mileage plus card. And when I had enough miles, I would go interview. And I usually wanted enough miles to take me and one of my children because I wanted to show my children. I want them to hear this information too. So my 9-year-old and I took off and we went to England and we interviewed Sister Sarah. And we went to Israel and we went to Croatia and we went to a couple of other places. Later on, my older son interviewed in Africa with me. So let's just look for a moment at why did I call this whole presentation The Hidden Side of Peacemaking? Why was that the title of my dissertation? And one of the reasons is, well, let me go back and say that the committee said to me, okay, it's great for you to get these random nominations, but you've got to have at least 2 identifications for each woman, one from someone else and one from the woman. And when I would call people up whose name I'd been given, I'd say, I'm doing this dissertation. Would you mind if I interviewed you about your peacemaking work? And almost to the woman, with one exception, they said, oh, I would love to be interviewed by you. But I'm not a peacemaker. I'm a sculptress. I'm a nun. I'm a nurse. I'm an Olympic skier. And I'm going like, I'm not going to be able to meet this criteria for my committee. So my oldest son said, Mom, look, ask them their definition of peace. and ask them if they're doing anything to make that come about. Yeah, it takes a teenager to get you clear on things like this. So those were the first two questions of my interview. And I asked them other questions like, so what's your definition of peace? What are you doing to help bring this about? How are you funding this work? How did you find this work? How did you keep your spirits up when things got rough? How dangerous was your work? What role, if any, do you feel that forgiveness plays in peacemaking? What advice would you give someone that wanted to become a peacemaker? What metaphor do you have for yourself? That was offered to me by my committee chairman, and I thought she was a little crazy, but it was a very, very valuable question. So I went about interviewing these various women. At one point, I had done a presentation in my small town of Paonia, Colorado, and the next day somebody came up to me and said, where are you going next? That was a great presentation last night. What are you going to do next? And I said, well, I'm out of graduate school. I'm out of mileage plus points, but I'm saving up my money to go to Asia because I haven't interviewed there. And he said, you know what? I've been flown all over the world to talk about my career, which is conservation. I have more miles than I know what to do with. Here are all the miles you need to go to Asia with. So then I was able to interview 13 people in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, places like that. So about halfway through, people would send me things because they knew I was collecting information on this. Went out to my mailbox and I got something a friend had sent, and it was a request for funds for a camp called the Global Children's Organization. It was from a woman in Los Angeles who was going to help the Bosnian refugee kids. The Bosnian War was still raging at this time. It had just barely gone to the table to be negotiated, the peace being negotiated. And I went like, well, I think this is a really interesting woman. I called her up in Los Angeles and I said, you know, I don't quite have the money to donate a lot to you, but if you're doing a camp for these kids in Los Angeles, I could come cook, or I could come be a counselor, or I'll come make beds. I'll do anything to support this effort. And she said, you are on. That's what this is all about. She also then said, I just have to let you know that this camp isn't in Los Angeles, it's in Croatia. So I was hooked pretty much. I had read enough about the Bosnian War to know that we weren't getting the truth about it and that it was horrible. So I kind of farmed my own kids out to my relatives. I went over there for 2, which turned out to be 3 weeks. And we had 80 kids in that camp. And they ranged from Sarajevo to little rural place called Srebrenica, where the Serbs had gone in and marched right past the UN peacemaking soldiers. And they had collected every male over the age of 14 and either shot them and killed them right in front of the children, or they had taken them away and were now finding the mass graves where they are. So I spent 2 weeks with these kids. And then the kids begged us to go home with them because they said, if we just want you to tell the world what happened, because we think that if anybody really knew what was happening here, there wouldn't have gone a war for 4 years that went on. So please go back and see what you see, tell them what you've heard from us. And I did. I went home. That changed everything for me. I went home and I thought, this can't be an academic exercise anymore. I've got to actually do something about it. So I spent a year calling the president, telling hundreds of people about this war and things like that. So it changed from women peacemakers and these fascinating stories about these ordinary women doing extraordinary things with a new drift to it, which is what we can learn from them. How can we learn what these women did and then start doing it? And when the women wouldn't identify themselves as peacemakers, I realized that part of why this isn't a very well-known aspect of peace is because Nobody cops to it. Women thought it was pretentious to call themselves peacemakers. And so as you listen to these women's stories, I want you, what you're going to go is like, whoa, that's amazing what she did. And this was a woman who was thinking she wasn't a peacemaker. So by the end of this presentation, one thing I hope you'll do is think about something you might have done or you might plan to do, and you can wear the mantle of peacemaker. As I would interview these women, get their definition of peace, and then ask them what they were doing, I would say to them, do you feel like this actually would qualify you as a peacemaker? And then I'd be quiet for about 2 minutes. And one after another, I would watch their face change and their consciousness shift and going like, okay, I guess I'm a peacemaker. So let's see. Also, you're going to learn that another reason this is so hidden is because this work happens at the very earliest levels of conflict. Sometimes when it's not like this, it's like this. It's hugely different between the power and the oppression. So Rita, let's go maybe next to the picture of Judith. This is the woman that did the Croatian camp. And this was the essence of what she was all about. When I interviewed her, I said, why are you doing this kind of camp? And she said, the concept of hatred growing in the hearts and minds of yet another generation of children is abhorrent to me. I think one way to do that is to interrupt it with goodness, the power of goodness. So at this camp, the way we did that is we had small groups of these kids. We hung out with them. We hiked with them. We listened to them. We had break dances every night. We ate together. We played together. We sang together. And at night, I was in charge of a room of 10-year-old boys, about 5 of them, and I would just rub their feet at night. That's how they began to feel safe for the first 2 weeks in 4 years. And it was the power of goodness. And she had 50 manifestations of it that she helped us do. So next, let's go to one of the other women here, a woman by the name of Sister Mary Vertucci. Mary is a Maryknoll nun, an order of nuns that often gets sent overseas to do service. She was sent to Tanzania. For about 26 years, she just taught different classes in Tanzania and got to know the Maasai people. She wasn't sent there because there really wasn't any educational centers in the Maasai land. But she got to know them. And then she was asked to be on a research team for studying the whole Maasai people. And it shocked her. She felt like actually this whole set of people were headed toward extinction. And one of the problems was lack of education, even though it was a national law that every child in Tanzania should have an education. There simply was not the opportunity for that education in a pastoral group of people. So Sister Mary decided she was going to start something called Imusoi. And it was a center in Arusha, which is one of the closest towns to where the Maasai are, although close means like 7 hours drive, things like that. And she was going to make it possible. It was especially strong that the girls were not getting education of any kind. And at age 11 or 12, they generally went through a genital cutting, and then they were married and had kids by the time they were 13, 14, 15. Pretty strong pattern. Sister Mary said, what can I do to help break that pattern? So she created a center in Arusha. I interviewed her on her first year there. She had a little 4-room house. She had 4 bunk beds, but she had 6 young women. So they were sleeping head to toe on the beds. And she was providing a safe place for them to be, a way to find out how to survive in city life. She asked them what their hearts wanted them to do. And then she didn't say, you should go to school here and I'm going to teach you. She said, what do you want to do with your longings? And then she helped them learn the languages. They spoke the language Ma. She helped them learn Swahili and to learn English, which were the educational languages. She then helped them. They could never pass the national exams to get into the school, so she would tutor them so that they could get there. And then she had brought the few Maasai women that had made a place for themselves in the world in to talk to these girls and let them see a whole nother thing rather than simply getting married at age 12 or so. So the Maasai mothers began to hear about this, and they would somehow get a message to Mary, and she would take her Range Rover out at night, her borrowed rickety Range Rover out at night. The mother would be there in the night, put the girl in the car, kiss her goodbye, knowing that she was on a path that was brand new, that she herself as a mother had never been able to take. And Sister Mary would drive home to Arusha. The mother knew that the next day she would probably get punished by her husband because there was a wedding planned, and the husband was going to get cows, which is the commodity of exchange. So that was in 1999 that I interviewed her. The latest I heard from Sister Mary is that she's now introduced 1,500 girls to educational opportunities. Some of them are technical things. Some of them are academic things. They now have school teachers. They have laboratory technicians, secretaries, tour guides, tailors, cooks, pharmacists, social workers, bookkeepers, accountants, community developers, human resource managers, agro-business owners, engineers, environmentalists, veterinarians, agricultural extension workers, lawyers, and medical doctors. So a very diversified economic stability for this whole people, the Maasai people. And what she knows now and what she's seen is that these girls go back to their homes and they introduce all sorts of new ideas about where to go, what could happen. And it's uplifting an entire people. So one of the things you're going to hear is that these women work at the individual and at the systems level. So by working with each girl every day, she helped lift up the entire Maasai people. So another person we're going to talk about next is Shahala. Shahala, this is sort of a double peacemaker story, a male peacemaker and a female peacemaker. Shahala was an Iraqi girl. By the time I interviewed her, she had been through 3 wars and she was she was in her late 20s. So what she did was, the Third War actually took out Baghdad because we went over there and intervened when Saddam Hussein would not behave. And she loved Baghdad and she watched it be destroyed, and she started to get quite depressed. And by the way, Shahala was a Kurd. So that was one thing Saddam Hussein had done, was to poison gas a lot of her people. But even though that happened, her family felt that because her depression was beginning to overtake her, they should send her up north to the Kurdish area so she could live with a sister and sort of get out of watching her beautiful Baghdad being destroyed. So she went to live with her sister, and there was an ad in the newspaper for somebody to help an organization called Counterpart. And what they wanted was people to distribute medical supplies that had been sent over by Counterpoint to the hospitals and things like that. That job morphed into another job down in the really highly militarized area in Ramadi and Fallujah. And the job she was given was, you have 4 months, and Counterpart would like you to interview the elders in the communities around there and find out what they need. And then hire local people to meet those needs, use local materials to use them. And what we'll supply as counterpart, an American NGO, will supply the money to buy these things, but we're not going to tell you what to do. You have to get the information from the elders to find out what they need. So counterpart sent over one person to help Shahala. And it was a 50, 60-year-old fellow by the name of John Barbe, who'd been a Peace Corps volunteer and knew that you've got to get people to identify their own needs. You can't go in and tell them what they need. Very different approach for many NGOs. So he helped Shahala behind the scenes, much like Rita is helping me behind the scenes. And she had this disadvantage. She was a woman. So she couldn't even go out on the streets by herself. She had to recruit her brother as the first volunteer so she could walk around the streets. But one of her hardest tasks was to go to the elders and say to them, a woman, like who are they to listen to it, and say to them, tell me what you need. I'll do my best to get the local resources and meet those needs. If you don't like what we've done in 4 months, we'll close up shop and get out of here. But this is how she, I want to tell you what she said to them. She did this. Instead, it said this. She knew that these elders had so much to lose, but so much to gain by a message given to them that they could hold on to. She spoke quietly to them as a fellow Iraqi, as someone like all of them who had suffered under the dictatorship of Hussein, whose family members and heroes had been killed, whose children had been denied educations, whose communities had been ravaged by the sanctions and the occupation, and who had been isolated from the international communities. She invited them all, Sunni, Shia, Kurd, and Christian, to start taking back their futures and rebuild their communities. She simply suggested that they identify projects that they needed in their community and then give her and her team 3 months. If they didn't like what they saw at the time, she would pack up the project and leave. In the end, here's what happened. In 4 months, they rebuilt health centers, glass factories, gardens, mosques, community health centers. And the impact of this was that there were 1,400 new jobs provided in a place that had a 60% unemployment rate. But more than that, what she saw happen was that the community started to feel a sense of ownership. And they felt proud of themselves. And they felt hope for the first time. All of this was done by John talking with Shahala, empowering her to talk to these people. If she had some gaps in her knowledge, like he helped her put on a conflict resolution workshop and a how to identify your needs workshop. She would give the first day of presentation. John would back her up with details if need be. But basically, a woman in a very patriarchal society pulled off this project in 4 months. So what she said to me was, John empowered me to empower my fellow countrymen and women. All right, let's go on to another one. I will be more quick about these things, I hope. This is Chito Govera. Chito was born as an orphan. Well, no, she was born as a young girl in Zimbabwe, rural Zimbabwe, never knew her father. And in a way that she didn't get until she was much older, she lost her mother to AIDS at age 7. This immediately made Chito the head of family for herself, her 5-year-old brother, and her almost 100-year-old grandmother. She also lived in the back of the yard where her uncles lived. And in order to feed her sibling and her grandmother, she finally had to drop out of elementary school and just work in everybody's field. Often she would come home empty-handed, and she just killed her to hear her brother cry himself to sleep hungry. But the other thing that was happening is the uncles, when you're an orphan girl in Zimbabwe at that time, it was kind of a given that males could do anything they wanted to. And her uncles got to her sexually, physically, psychologically in many ways. And when she was 11 years old, a woman in the village nominated her for a scholarship. The scholarship was for a 1-week class given in the capital or a nearby town in how to grow mushrooms. That 1 week turned Cheeto's life around. Not only did she come home with a way to make food, a way to make enough food to sell the food so that she could then pay the school fees for her brother and some of the little kids in the village. But most important, she came home realizing she could pick who she wanted around her in life. She did not have to just be a victim of her uncles. So, long story short, she was asked to come back for the full-on training, the 3-year training in mushroom. And it was run by an organization called ZERI, let me see what ZERI stands for. Can't remember it right now, but the head of the ZERI, head of that organization actually watched Cheeto go through this program and eventually adopted her. But the program then sent Cheeto all around the world, teaching other people how to grow mushrooms in India, in all over Europe, in several developing countries. And because she had developed a way to do it visually, she didn't have to know all these languages. Again, let's go a long story short. Zero has now, back a minute. When she was 19, all the abuse that happened to her when she was a kid began to tumble in on top of her. The fellow from ZERI made sure that she could get some help at a rehabilitation center in Switzerland. And they gave her a choice. When she was there, they said, look, you can write out what happened, you can talk out what happened, or you can counsel out what happened. She said, I think I'll write it out. So she wrote a little book called The Future of Hope. It was a dream she'd had about how she could teach orphans to never have the same experiences that she did. She now has an incredibly viable center in Zimbabwe for where orphan girls, orphan boys, and other disadvantaged people are able to learn the skill of growing mushrooms, the skill of how to self-determine your own future, and the skill of how to have hope. Cheeto's now in her 30s, and she just recently got married, which was pretty amazing to overcome that kind of trauma to the point where you would trust a male enough to partner with him. So she has the Center for the Foundation for Hope, and this is one of the guiding missions of it. By providing food security, it improves the conditions necessary for their self-development, with the ultimate goal to end poverty, abuse, self-pity, and victimhood at a grassroots level. I want to tell you now something with my hand motions that's really important. So can we switch me for just a minute over to being the full? So you see my definition of peace. But what I want to tell you about the way these women go about making peace is when they see a disparity like this, they want to make it equal. And there's lots of ways to do that. One thing they don't do is this: squash the oppressors, because it never works. It's not sustainable. The other thing these women do not do is they don't do this. And they also don't do this. This form of peacemaking actually looks exactly like this. So it's empowering someone else to empower themselves on a joint journey together. And that's exactly what Cheeto does. When she walks around her place, she doesn't tell these kids what they should do. She tells them her story. And they go like, wow, if you can become what you are, I want to learn what you learned. All right. Next one would be Yvonne DeMello. Yvonne is from Rio de Janeiro. And she, long story short, what she's done for most of her adult life is work with the favela kids, the shantytown kids, the street kids in Rio, which were basically the victims of the drug lords. The drug lords would do their drug deals, but to deliver them and do different things like this, they would often recruit these kids. These kids were living in the streets because the poverty was so bad in the homes that they lived in. Also, if they did a drug deal wrong, the drug lords would just come in and shoot them. Also, the police had no respect for these kids whatsoever, so they would discipline them any way they wanted. And when I said to Yvonne, I said, how do you go about, what do you do to help lift these kids up? She said, well, the very first thing I have to do for them is I have to teach them that they exist. I said, exist? I mean, that kind of floored me when she said that. I thought, how do I know I exist? Or how do you teach someone that they exist? It's a given for an American kid to grow up that way. She said, well, sometimes I just take one of the kids and we walk from the curb where they've been on my lap and I say, come with me. We go out into the middle of the street. We look up at the sky and we go like, I am somebody. And I have to say, I'll never forget Yvonne telling me that. It's the most simple, effective form of peacemaking I've ever seen. The other thing she would do is teach them about where they lived, that they live in this neighborhood, in this town, in this country, in this world, and that at every level they have rules about what's fair and what's not fair. She would teach these kids to read using the children's code as the primer for their reading. And at one point, the police came in and investigated some situation in the ghetto where she was teaching the kids. And the kids called her up at home and said, can you come down and help us? There's something illegal going on. So the first thing she thought was, great, they know they exist. And they know that there's some rules helping them out. And then she went down and ended up finding out who the police were and suing the police department and taking the kids with her as witnesses so they could learn about self-empowerment. She now, to make a long story short, so she started schools under the bridges for these kids. She has figured out how to teach children who are traumatized. And so she starts every day, she starts with every kid and say, what happened to you last night? What's going on in your life? So they could understand why they're acting the way they are today. She knows that she can only teach them. Most of these kids have been addicted themselves. So their learning spans is very short. So she knows how to teach them in very short modules. She started something called Project Urera, and it is how to teach traumatized kids. And it's now spread all over the world for kids that have been boy soldiers, inducted into being soldiers. They're traumatized too. This kind of learning works for them. So there's much more to her life. I would have the joy of interviewing not only her, but her daughter who helped her. And you'll find that in the book. The daughter's contributions are very good there. All right, very next person we're going to look at is a woman by the name of, do we have Sambun or not? Let's just go right there, whoop, back. Nope, forward, there. Sambun is from Bangkok. Right, the time she was graduating from high school was the time when all the textile factories were growing in Bangkok. And she went to work the day after she graduated in the ironing and cleaning room of a textile factory, known as the Bangkok Weaving Factory. So 12 years after she was working there, she began to get sicker and sicker. She went to doctors several times. She actually ended up in the hospital several times. And everybody said, wow, you've really got something going on with your lungs. But we're absolutely sure this has nothing to do with where you work. Even though she knew that the room was very full of dust, it was very dark, it was very hot, it was very noisy in the room. And so she went to the employer and said, I think it has something to do with what's going on in the location where we're working. And he said, I don't think so. So by the time she had lost 40% of her lung capacity, she finally found one doctor in Bangkok that would say, this is related to your employment. You have a choice. You can either leave that employment or you can get the employment to change. So Samboon and 7 other people started filing a suit to make the owner of the factory change the environment. Not only did he refuse to do it, he refused to admit that it had anything to do with him. And it also had a whole network of doctors that would never call it employment related. She had a disease called businosis, and it is lethal for most people if you continue to work in the same thing. Samboon decided that she would, up until he fired her, she was going to stay in that factory and keep pressing on the owner to change things. So it took 15 years for the suit to come. Well, in the first 8 years, they won the case, but the owner immediately appealed. And that happened again at the 11th year. And then finally, there was a notice that came out that said, no, this company is filing bankruptcy. They can't pay any of these. And then the notice came out that said, well, actually, they really aren't filing bankruptcy. So it took 15 years before there was a final settlement. It was way less than the original request, but they did win. And Samboon has gone on to help many other organizations that needed some change at that level. This woman had the essence of both patience and perseverance. And this is the poem she gave me at the very end of our interview. A bunch of feeble sticks may pry a log. A small power may overcome massive power with perseverance. No strong power shall withstand. All the small sticks come together bravely with 2 hands of a worker. Any force shall crumble. All right, one final introduction I want to tell you about would be Theo Coburn, and I'll be as quick as I can about Theo. It's very complex. Theo was from my hometown in Colorado. She grew up in the era of Eleanor Roosevelt, Amelia Earhart. Those were all her women kind of mentors. But she was a scientist, and she started doing research in Colorado by going up into the hills and finding out that the mayflies that were flying around in the creeks had their bodies, dissecting their bodies and analyzing what was going on to them, would tell her what was going on in the coal mines. And therefore, it was affecting the mayflies this way, and it was affecting humans by extrapolation other ways. The biggest gift she gave to us was that she really began to find out what petroleum products are doing to our bodies, to our mental capacities, and to our future. She, at one point, she knew that there were scientists all around the world that were doing individual projects about this, some of them about women's fertility. Others were doing penguins in the Arctic. And she actually brought about a conference for all of these people that she specifically invited. She locked them into the conference room for 3 days, the conference center, and she made them look at each other's slides. And they would go like, wait a minute, why are you showing that slide? That looks just like the slide of my fish in the Great Lakes area. And she'd go like, really? So by the end of 3 days, all these scientists realized that that was the core essence of all this was petroleum products. And her gig was to say what petroleum products actually do for our wombs, for uterus, the fetuses in our uteruses. And I want to just read this part a little bit. Let's see. Well, I think what I'll do is just take what's on the slide right here. She realized that a teeny tiny amount, like 1 drop in 20 swimming pools of petroleum products introduced into the uterus when it is nurturing a fetus, can cause things like ADD, can cause things like drop in fertility in generations of people, can cause a whole interruption of the endocrine system. So she called them endocrine disruptors. And she then, toward the end of her life in her 80s, she had looked at the accumulation of the information she had, and she said, because exposure to petroleum products in utero undermines the intellectual and the emotional capacities of the fetus, I'm afraid we are producing fewer and fewer what I call leaders in our society today. People who have the compassion and people who think beyond themselves. We have done this without realizing. We are losing our humanity. Very fascinating story. It's a peacemaking story because the oppression was something we didn't even know. We didn't know that the petroleum products did this. We didn't know how the petroleum producers were changing the laws at national levels. And we didn't really know how to stop it. Theo put that train on the tracks and got it started. All right, let's go to the next slide. Let me go again and just reiterate a couple of things. What is this kind of peacemaking? A conscious act of working alongside another. I've underlined the really critical words in this. So it's a conscious act. In a minute, you'll find out how conscious and spontaneous interact with each other. And it is working alongside each other. The point is to level the playing field of opportunities so that they can empower themselves into a place of equal choices and equal respect. So it's never done alone. It's not someone sitting at a mediation table or at a peace table. It is 2 people working together. And you'll see that not only does the person that was originally unempowered become empowered, but what happens to the person that is on the other side of the empowerment climb is stunningly beautiful. So let's look at conscious versus spontaneous peacemaking. This kind of peacemaking is going on all the time, everywhere. So let me give you an example of, say, pretend you're a 5th grader and you are a pretty good athlete. You're pretty popular, and you've got a group of kids that you sit with at lunchtime that are a pretty tight group of kids. And one day you come out late from a classroom because you've been talking to a teacher, and you bring your tray out of the cafeteria and you go like, oh, there's no room at that table. Well, I really want to get out there and play basketball, so I'm going to go sit over at this table where there's a lot of space. So you sit down and there's only one kid at the table, and you start talking while you're eating, and you're talking about, let's say, the Olympics. And when you're done, you pick up your tray and the kid says, thank you for sitting here. Nobody sat at this table all year. And you go like, oh, I guess that's right. I have looked over here and seen one kid sitting at this table. How interesting. And you say, well, gosh, I loved our conversation. See you later. And you go take your tray in to be washed. That is a spontaneous act of peacemaking. When it becomes a conscious act of peacemaking is when the kid walks out of the cafeteria the next day and makes a decision about what to do. So anytime we have a decision in front of us, we have a choice. If we take the time to think about it, we have the choice. If you choose going in the direction of respect, you are headed on the path of peacemaking. If you choose to humiliate, you're on the path of violence and war. Those are the early steps that we have capability of choosing from: respect or humility. Next one, please, Rita. So when you do a Ph.D., usually you have a theory, you go out and test your theory, and you come back and either prove it or disprove it. I kind of did it all backwards. I just went out and got all the data, and then I had to go find someone whose theory fit what I learned from all these women. And the only person I could find was a guy by the name of Adam Curl. And he basically laid it out this way. He said, if you, the very low right corner is the people most of these women work with. They're so oppressed, they're so busy trying to get enough food or have a shelter for themselves or whatever it is, they can't think about where they are in this whole milieu of things. And so education is one of the main tools that's given. And at this level, everything's pretty static. And the reason it's static is because the power structure likes it that way. They're not going to help these people realize how oppressed they are and that they're the oppressors. So they kind of like it statically at this. When these women peacemakers come in, do the education, help the people uplift themselves just enough to go into square number 2. Then the people go like, well, wait a minute. Well, this isn't quite right. This isn't fair. This isn't equal. And they will start confronting. They may march. They may protest. They may file a suit like Sambun did. When that happens, that moves to the left to the negotiation area. And at this point, they at least get a seat at the table and they start negotiating what works, what's fair. Think of all the Irish conflict. They finally had seats at the table. And by the way, they put quite a few women at that. And then you go up to the top left. And this is what's called a sustainable peace. Everybody's pretty much got the same power. And peace kind of goes like this, but it never goes like this and gets static again. And if you look at the far left of that square, square 2, 3, and 4 are basically grassroots situations. But I think what's going on, these women are working at the tree roots level of things. And that's often why it's hidden. Often they don't get news in the media, but they don't want it because what they're doing is trying to quietly educate people so that they can then get up into the place where media will get their stories. Okay, let's go take a look at the next thing. So why would somebody do this kind of peacemaking? Well, number one is because it works. I mean, if you think about the fact that I randomly interviewed 60 women all over the world doing this kind of peacemaking, if you add up all the major systemic changes that they've brought about, it's pretty obvious that this stuff works. But it isn't fast. And it isn't, you don't stand up and holler about doing it. You just keep sticking with it every single day until you begin to see the empowerment happen. And then you continue to stick with it. Some of these women have not finished their work at the end of their lives. They have to find successors for themselves. Number 2, it's regenerative. My definition of regenerative is that you leave a place in a better shape than when you came. And this is true in every single one of these situations. Number 3, it changes things at both the individual and the systems level. For instance, let's not look at my example. There are people who, Sister Mary has lifted up the Maasai education level for all of the women, but she still goes and gets every single girl individually. If they falter at the school, she's right there to work with them individually. So you can't just work only at the systems level. You've got to stay attuned to both levels. Number 4, it's reciprocally uplifting. All you have to do is look at this hand motion. You don't have to be famous to be unforgettable. So you can just be a quiet, effective peacemaker, and you will never be forgotten by the person on the other side of your hands. Number 5, it balances out the multiple acts of violence in the media. Everybody knows we've got a propensity of reports about violence. These stories don't often get into the media, although I have to say, much to my excitement, more and more and more they do. If you read my book, you will sleep at night. If you read the newspaper, you're going like, ay, ay, ay. So we need to balance that. And let's go to the next slide for number 6. This is a win-win model rather than a win-lose model. It is about collaboration, not about competition. Number 7, if we don't do it, who will? Enough said. Number 8, because it has the potential to make war irrelevant. That's a pretty big statement. And let me, can we go for just a moment to Ruhama's slide, Rita? Can we find it for just a minute? I interviewed a woman who is a psychiatrist in Israel, and let's see, she's going to come up right now. Okay, there we go. So this is Ruhama Marton, and she has started an organization called, what she's done is gotten healthcare and human rights correction to everybody in Israel, including prisoners, refugees, the Druze, Palestinians, and those that are not legally in the Israeli system. So she's bringing health to them, but in the process of doing this, she's also realized that there were human rights that got violated all the time. And she actually sued the state of Israel early on for having beaten a Palestinian prisoner. And she's learned a lot about power dynamics. So what she says, when peace is made, it is a synonym for respect. And when people respect each other, they're willing to share power. She said that to me, and I had this little tingle go off in me at the time I was sitting across from her, and I thought, that's kind of interesting. And I have probably read this statement 100 times now. And when you think about it, when people are willing to share power, they don't have to fight. There are examples of sharing power, but just imagine things like, what if the Brownie troop had been led by both an adult and a child? Or what if you have at the negotiating table for peace, men and women? I mean, it's not impossible. It's not often done, but if it happens, you can see there's no need for competition. There's no need for conflict. There's no need for war. Okay, Rita, can we go back just a minute to where we were? So one more. So the last thing on why do this kind of peacemaking is according to another woman that I interviewed, and we can go to the next slide, Rita. This is the clan mother up at Standing Rock. And she told me a lot about the Native American sense of history and where we are in power struggles over the centuries. And she said to me, look, we should all acknowledge that each one of us was put on this planet at this important time in history for a very specific reason. And the reason is it's our duty and responsibility to speak up for the voiceless. And she did that by several things, going to jail up at Standing Rock and things like that. But she wasn't disturbed by everything that's going on. She said, this is just the way things are evolving. There used to be a female domination of an era, then a male domination of the power, then a female and a male. And I said, wow. She said, well, yes, and we're ending one of those eras. And I said, does that mean that it's up to the women to pull this out? And she said, no, it's really like this. It's going to be men and women sharing power with each other. Pretty hopeful. So let's look another very quickly for what's the recipe for doing this. I asked every woman what advice they would give for someone that wanted to be a peacemaker, and they all gave me ideas from their own experiences. Those are chapter 16 in the book. Then I hung up all of the information around a room and I said, these are so many women, so many different places, so many different projects, but what do they have in common? And that's chapter 17 in the book. And I'm going to give you a few ideas that across the board, these women practice for how they do it. I call it the recipe for how to do this kind of peacemaking. Number one is be awake when the opportunity presents itself. Number two is never lose sight of your goal and never get attached to how you get there. Number three, do not use violence of any kind, including to yourself. Number four, work simultaneously at the individual level and the systems level. Number five, pace yourself. Make a little peace, make a little dinner. Number six, every day revisit the wisdom of and your willingness to continue this work. The next one's operate from unconditional caring, not from sentimentality. The next one is making a difference in this world might be your primary form of compensation. If you need money to do your work, you might have to get creative about how to source it. And the last one is, and this isn't the last one, there are 24 of these items in chapter 17. So this is the last one I'm going to give you today. The amount of outside pressure you may feel from those that disapprove of your work, pretty much those that are in power, may be great. Meet it with a greater amount of inner resolve, integrity, and grit. Who does these acts of peacemaking? Well, there are 15 women in this book that you could say do it. There's 60 that I can tell you do it. But honestly, it's happening everywhere all the time. And you probably can think of something you've done that actually constitutes an act of peacemaking, but you've never thought about calling it that. So I've asked the reader in chapter 18 of the book, please do an act of peacemaking and mail it into me because I'm still collecting peacemaker stories. So it's doable by everyone at any age, at any location, at any moment. There's an opportunity for an act of peacemaking. And then if you keep conscious about it and wake up the next day and keep doing it, then you're in the business of this book. For instance, I used to donate money to an organization called Women for Women. I was I would donate money and they would give that money to a woman to go through a program, a 6-month program. But she would write me a letter and tell me what was going on. At some point, I quit answering her letters, but I kept the donation coming out of my account, my bank account. I know now that that's slipping backwards into a spontaneous. I need to write that letter back to that woman and stay conscious with her for doing it. So I also went to Jack Canfield. Not very many people have taken up the invitation to write me about an act of peacemaking. So I went to Jack Canfield and I said, how did you get 100 other books and examples of chicken soup for the soul when you were writing that book? He said, Barb, people are not going to turn these stories into you. You have to go after them. So I said, okay, what population could I most go after right now? And I thought, how about high school students? So I've been teaching this course called Conscious Peacemaking to 2 different high school students, one in my town in Paonia and another in another town in Colorado. And these kids read the book, reflect on the chapters and go, why is this an act of peacemaking? Then I tell them some of the information I'm telling you now, and then they have to do an act of peacemaking. And for this, what they get is, we can go to the next slide. Next, even after this, there we go. They get a certificate from the National Peace Academy for having completed this course. And there are only 40 of these certificates out there in the world right now. And these kids are using them to put on their resumes for college applications, for job applications, things like that. And I went to the National Peace Academy, and they agreed that this was worthy of getting this kind of certificate for them. And so the kids in my town of Paonia, their act of peacemaking was that they interviewed 16 elders in our community who were feeling unrecognized, unvalued, and they, as in the interview, they didn't do interviews, they simply had conversations with them. And they both talked about what it's like to feel undervalued. They talked about who they are. They began to value each other right in the 20-minute inner conversations. They videoed all these and they showed them at our local theater. And these people became beloved. I mean, both the teenager and the elder became well-known and beloved in our community. The kids at Crestone in the other school that I taught, this is the pamphlet from the interviewing. And then I taught a whole group of high schoolers in Crestone, Colorado, and their act of peacemaking was that I taught them this Peace Place manual, which is how to mediate, 4th and 5th graders, how to mediate. The high schoolers taught the younger kids how to do it. And so that was their act of peacemaking, for which they also got the certificates. So a lot of talk. That's pretty much who these women peacemakers are and what they have to teach us. So this is some information that you can find a book, find out more information about. But most of all, if we look at the last slide, if you've recognized something you are doing or plan to do, and you want to turn it into me, I'm collecting short vignettes of stories, of peacemaker stories. And I'll bet you can find it in yourself, you can find it in your community, you can find it in your child. If you want to write, email it to me. You just put in the subject line, a new peacemaker story. And now I will open this up for any comments, any questions that people might want to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Barb. Beautiful work that you're doing, and really appreciate you being with us today and sharing your journey, not only for your PhD, but the result in the book and the work that you're doing. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's an ongoing reminder for me when I worked on the film, The Third Harmony, a couple of years ago that we released for middle school and high school kids. It was to help them understand the true nature of humanity, that we're a nonviolent species.
Wow.
We come into this world hardwired for collaboration and cooperation, and you're just showing us once again that we are all living with this story that's just not accurate. It's not true about who we are as humanity. And I look around the world, and the reality is the vast majority of the 8 billion-ish number of people on the planet live in peace every day.
Yeah. Good
and
reminder.
Yet that's not what our mass media teaches us. And so I've got a friend and colleague, Marilyn King, who has been working in the nonviolence and specifically the peace arena for the last 40 years. And she started a social media campaign several years ago, just encouraging people to use the hashtag looks like peace to me, and taking photographs, throughout thetheir daily life, whether it's in nature or seeing little children playing or seeing, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational group of people standing at a bus stop, laughing and chatting with each other, just snapping a photo and putting it on their social media pages with the hashtag looks like peace to me. And it's a counter narrative to what the mass media is telling us, to your point in your presentation around
Plus, it sounds like it gets right through. A picture, that'll come right through fast. You don't have to read anything, and you laugh with the bus people.
Yep.
Yep, I love it. Thank you.
And so I think about her work, and one of the things she's done that I was reminded of in your work and what you've shared with us today is that there are multiple levels of peace. There's certainly the not peace that we all understand, whether it's a war zone or some kind of ongoing violence. But then there's a fragile experience of peace where maybe it's refugee camps or other places where at least people are in the not peace, they're away from the not peace. But then if we go up from there to someone has food, they've got shelter, they've got clothing, they've got basic physical security. I mean, that's basic peace.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of people in the world live in that place. And then if we move from there to relative peace, where maybe it's not sweet peace, as oftentimes when we hear people talking about peace, they jump to this vision of sweet peace where there's rainbows and unicorns and everything else. But if we can let go of that visual image of peace on earth from that perspective, and look at peace in the way that you've shared through your stories, it suddenly makes it possible for us to realize that peace on earth absolutely is possible, because most of us already live there.
And is actually happening
Mhm.
all the time, all around. Yeah, I agree, Tom. Yeah. And I will say that if you're confused about when you walk out the door and you want to go to the respect side or you want to go to the humiliation side and you start to do it, you just say, what if I was the recipient of this?
Yep.
Would it feel humiliating or would it feel respectful? And it's like the religions had it, every one of them has some little phrase like that. And it's the quickest checkpoint I know of.
Yep.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. And it fortunately or unfortunately, it starts with having peace within ourselves. Are we at peace internally?
Yes.
And then, are we at peace with those in our lives, family members, friends, neighbors, people in our community? And then are we at peace with nature?
And with Mother Earth. I mean, the thing I'm starting to look at right now is how do I really do an effective act of peacemaking with Mother Earth? And it's easy to say this, that you should do this, but that's trickier for me. So being more mindful about it.
Yep. I love the work that you're doing. I mean, you're working at the grassroots level, you're working at the tree roots level, you're sharing stories of people working at the tree root level and the grassroots level. You're educating children so that they have an opportunity to not only have the skills and tools, but fundamentally changing the way they see the world and the way they see humanity.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that makes me feel good. I can die with my eyes closed now, Tom.
I'm looking at the questions that have been coming in from the folks in the chat, and it's been a very active chat today. I mean, it typically is anyway, but today in particular, a lot of people sharing and comments coming in around peace, and people wanting to know more about your work and how to find out about it, and resources and where to go. And I'm looking for a specific question that came in. Let me see if I can quickly find it.
Is it 80? Am I seeing 89? 89, 90. Yeah. Wow. That's exciting.
While I'm scrolling along, I guess I would just ask you the question. In doing this work, what are you noticing about yourself? How has it shifted who you are and how you're showing up in the world?
I actually think about that a lot lately. I think it took me 30 years to interview the women. And at first I was just so taken with their stories that listening to them, I did a little tape recorder thing, and then I would transcribe them sometimes 4 or 5 years later, and I could remember what was cooking on their stove. I could remember what their kids were wearing that day. So I just felt gifted. to be in the presence of those women. But what I'm feeling now is that I think those women have rubbed off on me. I think, as a result of that, this serendipitous, these synchronistic things keep happening all the time. And I think it's because I'm at a different level of energy, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm about to turn 80. So I'm going like, I better hurry up with this. And then I go like, no, just being enmeshed in it for one more day is like worth whatever. Yeah. The bus hit me tomorrow. I'm a different person than I used to be, and I'm glad of it.
But what the question I was looking for, right, it was submitted by Elsie. She asked, what's the impact of having women realize they are in fact peacemakers and to identify as such? So, you know, what your first question with these women was, are you, you know, asking them or giving them the label peacemakers? They didn't identify as that. But once they're, you know, embracing that label, or at least it's presented to them, what impact did it have on them and their consciousness?
Well, I only met some of these women for like 4 hours or 5 hours, but in just when they were willing to, at the very beginning of the interview, stand up as a peacemaker, they changed their language sort of. And so, I mean, I'm going back and looking at some of these or listening to some of these tapes, and I'm going like, they were talking like peacemakers now. They used the word peace a lot. And interestingly enough, when I got to interview the mother and the daughter was way forward in the peacemaking thing. She said, Mom, you should call yourself a peacemaker. So I think they're coming out of that Victorian age where women were sort of to be seen, not heard. And there were a few really famous women that were up there doing it. I think they see themselves humbly, but effectively at a level of being important in this world, is what I would say. They didn't need me interviewing them to continue their work. They were hooked on their work. But in terms of thinking about how it had a greater impact on the young women that they might have been working with, I think they were much more aware of that kind of thing. It's pretty subtle. This whole kind of work is subtle. And then it's being compared to some of the other kinds of peacemaking, which is not subtle. It's very noisy. It's very, you know, newsworthy and things like this. But this kind of stuff, these women know at some level, because someone else used the word peacemaker with them, that they are making a huge difference in this world. I think, yeah.
It reminds me, a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to collaborate with a woman named Marie Dennis. She's affiliated with a Catholic organization called Pax Christi, which was an organization founded after World War II. And they have done some extraordinary work, both within the Catholic Church and outside the church, to bring about world peace. And Marie is a living embodiment of what you're describing. And she's incredibly strong, incredibly powerful, and yet just this beautiful, peaceful person. And she and I were leading a global conference with the Vatican on nonviolence, and we had about 850 participants from around the world.
Wow.
And so, you know, some of the people we had in attendance were Dr. King from the King Center. We had Mairead Maguire, the Irish Nobel Peace Prize winner for her work with dealing with the troubles in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. And each of these women were just are incredibly powerful, incredibly strong, and yet they embody what you're describing as that you know, emblematic symptom or symbol of peace.
I think it's the beautiful part, one of the beautiful things, especially that the clan mother taught me, is she said, when you partner, she said, it's time for women to stand up because we're coming out of a period where we didn't stand up. And she said, then find men of clear minds and good hearts and partner with them. And that's, I mean, that is going to uplift all of us, I think, in many, many ways. And there's no chest beating about it. It's just a joy and self-rewarding enough, I think, to be in that work. I mean, I'm really touched, Tom, by some of the things that you've worked on. I'm trying to write them down as fast as I can so I can go look at them.
Yeah. Well, I share it because the reality is there are millions of these acts of peace happening, or billions of acts of peace happening every day all over the world.
Yep. And it kind of looks like peace to us, right?
Yes. Yep. And there are so many extraordinary people who are just living their lives, doing what they're doing because it's what they're called to do. It's what they intimately, fundamentally know is the right thing to do. They don't hold themselves up as extraordinary or doing anything exceptional. And yet it makes a profound difference in their lives and the lives of their family, their neighbors, their communities.
Yep.
And somehow helping the next generation inherit a different world with a different narrative is critical. So it's a delight to have you here today and being able to share your message and the message of so many of these women around the world, to provide a counter narrative for what does it mean to be human.
Right. Get the news out there. And I think it's serendipity that you were able to be the host today, I would say.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's been a delight to have you on the program today. And Rita, thank you for your support and help. It's been a gift that you were able to show up as the angel that you are and make sure that today's program was flawless. So I would just ask Barb, any closing comments you'd like to leave with today?
Well, no, I guess I would say, just as you close out from this program, take another 5 minutes like we did in the beginning to breathe and just reflect on the peacemaker in yourself. When have you actually done something that meets this criteria? Or what's floating around in your head that you'd like to go in your neighborhood or to your family or to your organization and actually do next week that you've just been thinking about doing?
Well, thank you everyone for being with us today. Jim is still in France, but he'll be back hosting next week, and look forward to being with everyone again next week for Humanity Rising. Thank you all.